With a new president comes new relationships with other world leaders. In Europe, all eyes are on Donald Trump and how he will work with politicians in the UK, France, Germany, and other NATO allied countries. Here to speak with us about foreign policy in Europe is Professor Garrett Martin in the School of International Service at American University. Thanks for being here with us today, Professor.
My pleasure.
So, we can see, based on international polls, that Europeans were overwhelmingly supporting Hillary Clinton in this election. So what is the reaction now? We don't have Hillary Clinton as our president-elect. So how are Europeans feeling about that?
Well, I think there's definitely a lot of surprise and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of worry. I think Hillary Clinton was probably more of a known commodity. I mean, she had served as Secretary of State, so she had probably more relations with a lot of the current leaders and political class in Europe. Trump has been, let's say, maybe more vague about some of his intentions, and some of his statements have definitely created uncertainty, especially around NATO. So I think that's probably the biggest reaction.
Is there anything you think President-elect Trump can do to kind of gain the trust of European leaders and, European people in general?
Well, I think that there's several ways you could define trust. I mean, one of them could be if he moves towards positions that are more acceptable or more similar. I'm thinking, for instance, on climate change. I mean, some of the statements he's made seem to indicate a big gap between Trump's views and European consensus on climate change. But trust can also be, an ability to deliver on what you promise to do, being reliable. So even if you disagree, at least if you know where you stand with the Trump administration, that there is a clear message, I think that's a way of gaining trust. And I think on questions such as Russia, I mean, if there's a sense that there's a rapprochement with Russia, but it's done at the expense of European powers and of European players, I think that will create a lot of mistrust.
And there's the question of how much this could actually affect Europeans. So we have some statistics here saying that about 70% of Europeans polled in an international survey said that the US election would have a high or very high impact on their country. And almost 80% say that the US president should not focus solely on domestic issues. But in a practical sense, what would this mean for Europeans? Will it actually affect them?
Well, I think it could affect them. I mean, certainly take, for example, free trade. I mean, there's been a long standing negotiation over TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. There were problems with it even before Trump was elected, but Trump seems to be or the president-elect seems to be very skeptical or opposed. So if TTIP does go down the drain, as there is a serious risk, that has big economic consequences. I mean, there's a very large transatlantic economy. So that's a practical way in which that could affect the Europeans. If Trump reneges or is skeptical about Article 5, the core pillar of NATO, I mean, that could have practical security impacts on European states, especially in Eastern Europe.
So let's talk a little bit more about NATO. I mean, what does Trump's unusual relationship with Putin mean for Europe and NATO as a whole?
Well, I think the fact that President-elect Trump during the campaign was criticizing European states European states who are members of NATO for not spending enough on defense, that's been a refrain from a lot of previous administrations. That's not new. What's been new is the idea or the suggestion that maybe the United States would not come to the defense of its allies. So I think that if Article 5 is shown to be an empty, I mean, that could really mean the end of NATO.
So let's see, we have that clip actually from President-elect Trump. So as you mentioned before, Trump has criticized NATO. He's called it obsolete, and he suggested if member states can't pay the dues, then they may not be receiving military protection from the US, which is very unusual. But only about 4 countries can actually meet that spending requirement. So I wanted to ask you specifically, what does this mean for Baltic countries that may be facing threats from Russia in the future?
Well, I think the NATO guidelines are 2%. Yes, that's been a sort of common frustration. That being said, I think the problem isn't only about how much is being spent by European member states. They spend rather badly. There's a lot of waste, there's a lot of duplication, there's a lot of overlap. I think for the Baltic states, I think they were already concerned about whether Article 5 applied to them in the same way that it did for other countries. There were a lot of debates about whether there should be permanent NATO bases in the east because of the troubles with Russia over Ukraine. So I think for the Baltic states, especially if there is a rapprochement by Trump with Putin behind their back, I think that's going to further undermine their trust in NATO and in this whole partnership, the transatlantic partnership.
So you mentioned there's a lot of unnecessary spending or irresponsible use of funds. Could President-elect Trump's focus on spending be a good thing, a critical look at the way these funds are being used?
Yes, I think putting pressure and pushing the European states to spend more and more importantly spend better, I think is good. The problem is if it's accompanied with a sense that NATO is obsolete or NATO is not going to be useful or that we may not defend you in case of a crisis, I don't think that's going to be counterproductive. Okay? I think as long as you sort of combine it with a sense that American support is ironclad, that's one thing. But if you're already suggesting that NATO is going to fade into obscurity, then why spend?
So I want to zoom out a little bit and take a look at Trump's election in the context of some nationalist movements that we've seen across Europe. How does this kind of fit in with other similar trends? Take Brexit, for example.
Well, I think there's definitely similarities. One is that a lot of the pollsters were taken by surprise. Anti-elitism was definitely a very powerful driver in both sense. I think there are some obvious differences. In the case of the UK, there's been a long-standing difficult relationship with the EU. The movement around Trump, I think, has been more sudden. But there's definitely a sense that, again, I think if you look at anti-elitism, concern about immigration, those have certainly been sort of common threads in both cases. And common trends in some of the other populist movements. I mean, we have very important elections in Europe coming up in France in May. We have the elections in Germany. So, populism is a very significant and important power in Europe right now.
The New York Times recently ran an article saying that Angela Merkel they called her the liberal West's last defender. What does the Trump presidency mean for Germany? I mean, does that hold true in your opinion?
Well, I think that's a little bit of undue pressure being put on Chancellor Merkel, but it's true that she has been a sort of long-standing figure. She has been a heart of a lot of the problems and challenges that Europe has confronted. With the relative weakening of France, the traditional Franco-German motor has been maybe more one-sided. So there's certainly a lot of expectations. I think they're a little bit unfair, and also Merkel is more of is a relatively cautious politician. I'm not sure that she is necessarily the one who's going to provide grand strategic leadership. But it will be interesting to see how President-elect Trump deals with Angela Merkel. I mean, certainly Obama was able to create very good relations, very close relations. It will remain to be seen whether President Trump can do the same.
As we're seeing a rise of these more conservative politicians across Europe, could that make for better relations or more productivity if they're all kind of on the same page?
It's possible, but I think it is important to mention that populism has been maybe predominantly a phenomenon on the right, but not exclusively. I mean, you've had, if you look at Syriza in Greece, if you look at Podemos in Spain, there also have been populist movements on the left. Also, I think the political spectrum is a little different between Europe and the United States, so that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get along, even if they are broadly of the same sort of ideological family.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Professor.
My pleasure.
It was great having you. Professor Martin is in the School of International Service at American University.
President-elect Donald Trump's rhetoric about NATO during the presidential campaign has caused allies of the United States to worry about whether the U.S. will defend other NATO nations in the Trump administration. World leaders worry that Russia may be able to bolster its position in the world during the transition of power. Stephen Penchak has more.
President-elect Donald Trump spoke with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg by phone on Friday, affirming the United States' commitment to NATO. Both leaders agreed that progress has been made on fair spending by other NATO nations, but that more needs to be done. Throughout the presidential campaign, Trump often questioned whether the United States would defend NATO allies if they were attacked. Trump also said that American support would depend on the willingness of those countries to pay their fair share for military protection. In the first presidential debate, Trump spoke about his problems with NATO.
But two things. Number one, the 28 countries of NATO, many of them aren't paying their fair share. Number two, and that bothers me because we should be, yes, we're defending them and they should at least be paying us what they're supposed to be paying by treaty and contract. And number two, I said, and very strongly, NATO could be obsolete.
In an interview with District Wire News, Atlantic Council senior fellow Ash Jain addressed concerns about Trump's rhetoric about NATO.
What candidate Trump said during the campaign about NATO has raised deep concerns, particularly from those of us who have been long committed to ensuring that our alliances, that the U.S. alliance structure is sustained over the future. And, of course, Trump called NATO obsolete at one point. He questioned the value of our alliances. He even went so far as to suggest that maybe Article 5, isn't such a guarantee if some of our NATO allies don't contribute, in terms of funding to the alliance.
Jane thinks there is a chance Russia will test the United States on its commitment to NATO. For District Wire News, I'm Stephen Penchak.
Coming up, rhetoric about refugees has been filled with fear. What will the United States do in Syria? Will it close its doors to people fleeing from violence? More in a moment.
Powerful driver in both sense. I think there are some obvious differences. In the case of the UK, there's been a long-standing difficult relationship with the EU. The movement around Trump, I think, has been more sudden. But there's definitely a sense that, again, I think if you look at anti-elitism, concern about immigration, those have certainly been sort of common